Osha, and then
Sounds good.
Hi there, everyone. Thank you for joining today and for your time. I am very excited to have this very first for us of an actual presentation on how to be a better panel moderator and speaker for our Yosemite conference. I'm very pleased. I'm Allison Torbett of Nixon Peabody and one of the co-chairs of this year's conference. And joining me today are Jennifer Novak and Osha Meserve. Jennifer Novak is in the law office, of Novak, and Osha Meserve is from the Salouie Meserve law firm. So we're very excited to have you with us today. And we will also be circulating with this a PDF of the updated revised moderator guidelines, which will also be available as well as a recording of today's presentation. Both Jennifer and Osha are welcome to accept questions in real time. So feel free to raise your hand using the icon below, or you can also put it in the chat box if you feel more comfortable. With that, please take it away, Jennifer and Osha.
Thank you so much, Allison. Thank you all for joining us today. Osha and I are really happy to be able to talk all things Yosemite and help everyone get on their way for this year's conference. So this talk today is designed to be informal and interactive and informative. This is not going to be as formal a presentation as you might see at the Yosemite conference where we are getting MCLE credits, but we really wanted to be able to bring the perspective of people who have not only attended Yosemite, spoken at Yosemite, moderated panels at Yosemite, and planned Yosemite, but also get the feedback year after year regarding the panels that have been put on and things that went well or didn't go well. I will note that there are some of you on this call who I don't think have ever moderated at the Yosemite conference before. And some of you are also people who have either moderated or spoken at or planned the conference and are aware of some of the issues we've had in recent years. So to the extent that we have the ability to let people chime in, if we missed something, if we got something wrong, or if you have a tip for people, go ahead and share them and we'll try to catch them as we go. So with that in mind, let me start by just giving an overview of what the responsibilities of panel moderators are. You know, first and foremost, you have had some deadlines already, and that includes getting speaker bios and headshots in, but also making sure that your speakers were aware of the code to reserve rooms at the Tenaya. You have some upcoming deadlines coming up as well, which we'll give you a reminder of at the end. You're supposed to work with your speakers to plan the content. This is very much a process of ensuring that all the moving pieces are being put together. I like to think of the moderator role as like a talk show host. There's a lot of legwork that goes into it in advance to ensure a very smooth and fun process later on down the road. So Osha will go through this a little bit, some practice tips on how to ensure that your panelists are working together and that you have a handle on your content. I'm also going to note that one of your jobs will be, as we'll discuss later, to refine how the presentation will proceed and the timing of it. And then we'll also note to be on the lookout for some issues that may arise during the panels or during the Q&A session, or issues that may arise with your speakers, and perhaps what to expect and how to deal with that. So with that, Osha, why don't you walk us through some of what our moderators should be doing?
So we're under the responsibilities.
Yes, the planning panel and preparation.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you. See, she's kind of like a moderator here. She's prompting me to get to the right section. So the panel is going to be 90 minutes long, and we do like to leave about 15 minutes for Q&A. So a big part of being a moderator, and I think it's important for all the panelists, and I think we're revising the title of this document that you'll be receiving to also refer to speakers as well for that reason, because we want everyone to kind of be on the same page. And some of our panels don't have a moderator as well. So sometimes it's more of a shared responsibility. But definitely having a good sense of the timing is important going into the presentation figuring out who's going to help with that timing. But leading up to, it's September now, so it's getting close to kind of crunch time for these panels. So we do recommend having at least 3 planning calls before the deadline for the MCLE materials, and making sure to have some really, substantive discussions about what each panelist will cover, and as well as going over any of the more the simpler items that have to do with just, deadlines and materials. So we really think that having those talks, and as informal as they may be, you don't necessarily have to do the full dry run of the whole panel or rehearse every word, but having those conversations in advance across the panel in a Zoom meeting or a set of Zoom meetings, really helps the presentation go a lot better. And then in terms of scheduling, as the moderator taking the lead on that, we do suggest using something like when to meet or some kind of calendaring function to try to wrangle everybody together, making a short agenda for each of your calls, and then making sure that you understand what each panelist has to offer in terms of expertise and what their kind of key items they want to cover are, so that you can figure out how to put everything together into an effective panel.
All right. And then I'm also going to note, a lot of times speakers have an aversion to doing PowerPoint. Just feedback from this conference and other conferences show that people like having something to look at and to break up the monotony of just listening to someone speak. And it doesn't have to be involved, but I would highly encourage your speakers to have something that people can look at. Maybe it's a map, maybe it's a picture or a graph of some sort. Or if they're going to be just talking about cases, just putting the names of the cases up on the slides. You don't want it to be, as we'll go through later on, so detailed that people are just reading instead of listening, but it does certainly help. The feedback also shows that having interactive panels is preferred to a panel where you just have 3 people speak for 20-25 minutes each. So if, as the moderator, you have the ability to interject and maybe ask somebody to explain a little bit more, or you might even work it out with your panelists in advance, where if somebody's going to be speaking on a certain topic, you give another speaker the opportunity to give their feedback or their perspective or ask a question. So it enables there to be more of a discussion than just a series of lectures. On the slide, I also noted that you as the moderator will be in charge of coordinating the written materials, that you should make sure your panelists are aware of the logistics, when their panel is, what day it is, make sure they have their rooms, and ensure that everybody understands where they're supposed to be when. I wrote on this PowerPoint slide, also keep the peace, because we have had some instances in recent years where some of the panelists weren't getting along. Some had very strong opinions about what should be said or how things should be presented. And if you have a problem with your speakers or with anything, then my last tip here was keep your conference chairs informed. They're there to help you, but more importantly, they need to know if there's going to be some further coordination needed, such as finding a new speaker or maybe finding a way around some of the issues that you're having. Osha, anything else you can think of?
Yeah, just touching on the PowerPoint issue, I think the best panels have an integrated PowerPoint that is for the entire panel that pieces together maybe slides that each speaker has put together separately. And that can sometimes be challenging if speakers may be adjusting their slides a bit, right before the end. So, if you can do one PowerPoint, that is better. We've noticed with technological issues that, just having one PowerPoint go up is a lot easier than having 3 or 4 separate ones. And then the other thing I've noticed sometimes, I think we had this with our keynote last year, where Martha Guzman didn't have her PowerPoint at the last minute. And then everybody said, oh, the show was much better because she didn't have it. So I think we've all used PowerPoint ad nauseum, probably to the point that it gets in the way. So I guess, but I do think about like so many things we do, like we were discussing this flood panel we're working on that I'm helping with. And, you know, you sometimes really need to show a picture of what's going on to give people a visual of it and really further that understanding of what you're talking about. So I think visual aids and PowerPoints and pictures and diagrams are great. As somebody without great eyesight, I think, you know, the ones that go into the really nitty gritty of a holding of a case or some other stuff like that, I won't be able to see that anyway. I guess for the handout, it's helpful to have something to refer to. So that's the other thing as a moderator, is trying to kind of keep in separate buckets the different written materials that may be helpful for, and kind of maybe keeping it separate, what's going to be presented day of and what people are actually going to see during the presentation versus what's going to be a handout that might be more appropriate for things that are just like a lot of words or numbers together on a page that might be harder to follow from up on a PowerPoint slide.
Right, especially for the more technical presentations, it's almost worse to have a PowerPoint that is nothing but formulas and chemical abbreviations. I'm just going to add, OSHA, you know, I remember the day that I heard you made your panelists actually run through their presentations at least once before Yosemite.
I've done that, yeah.
I don't do that, but what I do is and I'm doing it this year, I work really closely with my speakers in advance to get a sense of what they're going to say so that I can start to figure out the moving parts. And even if we don't always have group calls, I'm trying to bring everybody together so that we're all in the same place by the time we get there. So to that end, you know, there are different ways of doing this in different styles, and it may be hard to get your speakers all together, but that's part of your management and your coordination, is to ensure that you have an idea of who's where. And if you, for example, see one of your speakers has a presentation that there is just not a chance that they're going to be within the time limits you've set, it's, you know, your duty to work with them on maybe being a little surgical about what they can present, but also noting that there are ways, as we'll get to in a second, to still draw out that same information, but in a different way. So anything more on this part of the pre-conference, OSHA?
No, I would say, I mean, it sounds like if people are raise their hand, we can unmute you to ask a question. So I would encourage anyone who's out there in the audience to do so, and I'll try to keep an eye out for you. Thanks.
All right, so then let's talk about the conference itself. For those of you who have not been to the Yosemite conference, I just put up a couple examples. You know, we are in a hotel, and just as an FYI, the size of the room that you're in is going to depend on how many people signed up for that particular panel in advance. Now, that doesn't mean that's who's going to show up, but that is how we gauge which panels might be more popular than others. I am the queen of like the 80-person audience. You know, the people who come to my panels are not there for a broad overview of things, but they're very committed to the one narrow thing I'm working on that day. So I might be in a room more like the one you see here, which is not all that big, but also be aware that people are going to be coming and going depending on how they feel in terms of you know, whether there was some other panel that didn't meet their expectations, and now they're coming to visit you. And there's something in the chat. Pam just put up a reminder for everyone. The materials are due September 21st, so you still have time. So one thing to be aware of is that the room that you're assigned also has an assigned IT AV person, and that person will be in that room throughout the conference. So to the extent that you are able, you have the opportunity to go in, meet with them, talk to them, you know, and even see how your PowerPoint presentation might be if it's uploaded already, and have them maybe walk you through it. Each room may have its own little quirks as well. And so it will be good for you to know in advance if they've been experiencing any problems with sound or the temperature of the room, etc. So it is part of your job to go in, make sure that everything looks like it's working well. You won't get a lot of time in between panels. So if you're following someone else, be aware that those speakers are still just lurking around, answering people's questions. You're really just going to have to usher them out to get the next group in and get your people all set up. Again, if you do have any technical issues, there is someone in the back of the room who can help you. I unfortunately have had an inability to run the PowerPoints while we go. And so it's nice to have someone assisting. To the extent that you can, please start on time. We run numerous panels back to back, and there are activities in the afternoons, and it's better to try to get going, even if people are still coming in, because there's no better way to get everyone to settle down than for them to know that their panel has already started. To that end, please remember that you have written materials. And so everybody's bio is going to be part of those materials. And I would encourage you to not spend your first 5 minutes just reading through a laundry list of people's accomplishments. If there are a couple of things that you'd like to highlight that are particularly amazing or of interest, I would encourage you to do that. But you can also refer to the written materials if people would like to know more about your speakers. I'm going to say, set your ground rules and roadmap. Let your audience know what to expect, right? It's a 90-minute panel. We're going to, hear from each person for 15 minutes or 20 minutes. We'll have some interactive. We'll then try to leave X amount of time for Q&A. But also part of this is defining what the Q&A actually is. It is a question that the panelists can answer. I would keep in mind, and you can think about the best way to express this, that we are not presenting every perspective that is possible on the issues that we're presenting. So one way to address that would be to note, we've got a very esteemed panel here to share their perspectives. You can feel free through your interactions with the panelists or the questions that you might prepare for them to bring in other viewpoints. I saw this done really well last year, where the moderator was being a little bit of a point counterpoint and maybe challenging some of the speakers a little bit on what they were presenting or how they were answering, because there were some differing points of view. And to just acknowledge, right, that it's not that there are 3 perspectives from the 3 panelists and that's it. It's also important to remember that even though we are now in a world where everyone wants to share, questions should be questions. And, it's wonderful that people would like to provide context, but we did have a number of situations last year where people stood up to give like a 2-minute speech, for example. Sometimes there was a question attached, sometimes not. And sooner or later, people then recognize the need to cut that off. And unfortunately, if you have allowed a few speakers to do that, and then you cut off the next person, it looks like you specifically targeted someone to say that, okay, you'll allow everybody else to speak, but you won't allow the next speaker. So please be aware that you need to be even-handed. And part of facilitating is ensuring that you jump in if needed. And if the first speaker is on minute number 1 now, you should feel free to jump in and very nicely apologize and say, I'm sorry, do you have a question? Or I'm going to move on. And that's your right, and that's your job. Osha, do you want to add something on that point?
Yeah, I mean, I think when trying to deal with those issues, like with, with a good attitude and a little bit of humor sometimes, I think might be helpful without belittling anyone. But yeah, absolutely. We've had a lot of, and I'm sure you've all heard where, it's not really a question and somebody may be very passionate about it. However, if we really only have 10 or 15 minutes for questions at the end, we want to be able to have that happen. And so if people have more substantive discussions they may want to have with panelists about their views or what they're advocating for, or what they feel may be missing from the panel, that could happen in a separate conversation. That's also what the evaluations are all about, and people can and do use those evaluations as ways to point out things that are missing. But I think that's a very good point that Jennifer made at the beginning of this segment, is just as a moderator, you can acknowledge at the beginning that not every viewpoint is represented here. We've brought forth the people, and I know from planning panels that often we're like, oh, well, there's also this viewpoint and that viewpoint. And it's like, if we were to try to represent every viewpoint on a panel, it wouldn't really be a 3 or 4 or 5 person panel anymore. And we simply wouldn't have time for it. So we do end up focusing on, a handful of viewpoints and expertise areas when we set up these panels. And there's nothing, I think there's no shame in that we've made those selections. And so I think, though, if in the course of developing and getting ready, and this is where having the meetings that we referenced earlier is so important, it's become clear that, yeah, we really don't have anybody here from that community, then, it may make sense to point that out right at the beginning that, due to time constraints or what, you don't have to make a big excuse, but just, here's who we have. And that way people, because I know, and I've felt that way myself before, sometimes watching panels, you're just dying because you feel like it's just not clear that somebody or something important is being left out. And you feel it's, as advocates, we feel very passionate about the need to point that out. However, it's not necessarily super interesting intellectual conversation about the topic at that point. It's more of a critique of the, the selected speakers or whatever. So it's, we're it's a work in progress for sure. But I think being aware that those issues may arise and feeling confident about the potential of having to cut off something that is not really a question. I think that's part of what, we're practicing to be better at, and just to, and I think the more that that's a potential something you may be called on and need to do as a moderator, then, when the time comes, you'll be up for it.
And I would say also in advance, there are a couple things you can do. I mean, one is if there are viewpoints that are being excluded that are, that you're aware of, and there's an easy way to include that in your written materials. We can always make sure that people are aware that we've provided some additional materials for you, that we don't have on the panel today. Another way, as I mentioned, is through questions. But I would also encourage you to make sure that your speakers are aware. I mean, they know what they know. And I have been in panels where the speakers felt obliged to answer questions they may not have known the answers to. The audience should then not have to be in the position of like being torn. Do I correct them? Do I not correct them? It's okay to be there, with the information and the expertise they have. And, there may be things that they just aren't familiar with, and that's okay. Another point I said on this PowerPoint is your job is to not only keep time, but manage your speakers. If you know that someone is likely to go long, I don't know, think about putting them last, if it makes sense, so that they're not stepping on the time of the speakers who also have yet to go. There are also ways to, as I mentioned, tee up questions. I mean, my panels tend to be this way, where I've told them all in advance based on the feedback I've had from them in advance. I'm going to be asking the following questions. I'd love each of you to weigh in, and maybe you don't have to put some of that in your actual presentation. I will tee it up for you later as we all engage in a conversation. But there often are speakers who just, even if you're flashing time cards at them, like they have 5 more minutes, they have 1 more minute, they are done. I'll use OSHA's term, are passionate about what they have to say. And so that may be difficult to cut them off. So I think if you let them know in advance, hey, everyone, whether it's an audience member or whether it's a panelist, like we love having these kinds of discussions. We love people being this passionate. This is the perfect opportunity to have some more conversations after the panel, or in the hallway, or we're going to stick around and talk to you afterward. I don't know that I have too much more to say about Q&A for those of you who have not been to the conference. The moderator is the person who tends to look out and just decide whose hand is up and who should be able to ask a question. If there's another way you'd like to consider, please do. I've toyed with the idea of asking people to fill out a question on a card, but that seems a little less of a conversation and a little stiffer, so I haven't done it yet. And also just be aware that different perspectives in the room, try to ensure that you're hitting a broad number of people, some young, some old, some dressed well, some not, who cares, but just that you're not going to the same people all the time. And then also remind everyone that there is an evaluation form, and by filling it out and commenting on the speakers and commenting on the decorum in the room, you really do allow us to grow and be better. There are some comments that we will always get every year, that we can always bring in a wider variety of people, and we endeavor to do that. But we, again, we try to do our best, and the only way we can do that is to get the evaluations.
I would say one thing about the Q&A too is that especially in the smaller rooms, we probably won't have the microphone. The microphone is usually there during the plenaries, and so that allows everyone to hear it. So you'll just, as the moderator, need to keep an eye out for that. And if typically, a lot of times people can't hear the question, and then also if there's a recording going on, then the recording is definitely not picking it up. So, and this is another way to kind of keep people honest about, actually asking a question versus some other thing. Is that, you should be able to repeat the question for the folks that may be listening to the recording later, or for the remainder of the people in the room that couldn't quite hear what the person in the back said. So I guess that's something when you come in to check out your room in advance, see if there is a microphone, but I'm thinking probably there really won't be. So you'll need to repeat it. Is that right?
And also sometimes there might be someone that you recognize who is on, either a planning coordinator or on the environmental law section at XCOM. If there is a mic in the room, you might even think about asking them whether they would help you out by kind of traveling around the audience. I'll age myself, Donahue style, with the microphone to make sure everyone can be heard. We do have a comment in the Q&A, so I'm going to go ahead and note there is no one way to do these presentations. And so you can opt to do your presentation in a variety of ways and work with your speakers on what feels best in that situation. I was asked to explicitly mention that you could do shorter presentations, like 5 minutes, and then make it interactive. And actually, that's how my panel, if all goes well, is going to be. I'm giving my speakers about 10 minutes max to introduce themselves, their affiliation, their perspective, and how the subject matter comes into their day-to-day lives. And then we are going to tee it up for a series of questions. I've also seen people just start with questions and make the whole thing a series of topics that everybody had the chance to respond to. All right. And then again, as we've noted, there are also the more traditional ways of doing it, where you just have your 3 or 4 speakers each make a presentation, and then you go to questions.
Which people really love. I agree with the comment there that people do like this. I think it's easier to pay attention to, because you allow people to do a little setup, who they are, where they're coming from, what their expertise is, kind of what their pitch is with respect to the topic. And then if you've done this prep work that we're talking about, then you're kind of trying to bring it all together and have it actually turn into something bigger than any one of the speakers could do on their own, because their ideas are getting tested and questioned and added to, and that it tends to make a much richer presentation. And then and the other thing is that I think it's easier to manage the time as well, if you're not like basically taking the 90 minutes, say 90 minus 15, like 60, and saying like we each get 15. Then if somebody goes long on the 15, you're just like, oh, there's no time for questions type thing, which is awful. So giving people shorter leash of like here's your 5 minutes, and then then you as the moderator, with maybe asking questions that you've thought of in advance across the panel, you're able to manage the time more effectively, because you're not at the point, we've all been to these panels where it's like, oh, we've heard from 3 of the 4 speakers and there's no time left, and somebody came all the way from Denver, and now there's no time for them to speak. We can't have that. So that's where these shorter segments really can be helpful.
And as an example, I've been speaking with one of my speakers, and his agency is very heavily involved in a court case. And rather than have him present that court case up front, he's going to mention it. And then later on, I'm going to ask him to talk a little bit about it so that, he gets a chunk of time just to focus people on that case. And I'll be honest, on a personal note, I have a harder time just sitting and like really focusing on longer presentations. And so my personal preference is to keep it lively and interactive, and then I take way more from it. All right, before we move on, anything else on this, Osha, that you can think of? All
No.
right. All right, upcoming deadlines. We do have a September 21st deadline for your written materials. Because this is all done electronically, keep in mind, yes, if one of your speakers is giving you a hard time, it could still make it into the materials. But in order for us to make sure that everything is MCLE compliant, then we want to be sure that the conference coordinators have an opportunity to see everything, and we can kind of coordinate. You can also be sure that you're not running into things like copyright problems. PowerPoint presentations should be, if the PowerPoint presentation is going to be your written materials, then yes, those are due on the 21st. And that is what some people do. For other people, it might be a series of white papers or, case summaries that they have done. There are bar rules on this, and we are going to have some do's and don'ts as part of the written handouts that everyone gets. But if you are planning to make your PowerPoint presentation your written materials, then yes, that is subject to the deadline as well. Let me also note, as part of that, one way to handle having an easy to read PowerPoint presentation with having the sufficient bulk and merit to your presentation for it to pass for MCLE might be to mention a case and the citation, and then on a different slide at the end to actually include, some more information about that case or a series of statutes or regs that pertain to something that you don't have to read as part of the presentation, but are there so people can refer back to it later. And I'm going to go to the next slide because at this point, I'm not confident which PowerPoint version I have up. So we'll see if, there we go, this works. All right, so there is a template for PowerPoint presentations, and it is the one we have been using with the picture of Yosemite on the side. As Osha mentioned, it is just easier to have one coordinated PowerPoint presentation. But if you are up to it, then certainly you can, you or your speakers can pull up their own. Just be aware of the extra time it may take to deal with any sort of issues. I said, watch copyright laws. A lot of times people just sneak pictures off the internet without giving credit, or if they're not supposed to. That is part of what we're supposed to be doing, is ensuring that people are aware that those are issues as well. Okay, and then I'm just going to put a couple extra reminders in here. Be sure you're aware of when your panel is and that your panelists are aware of that and that they've arranged for their travel in advance. Make sure they have their rooms, and talk to Pam, who was on the call with us today, if your speakers were not able to secure rooms, she can add them to the list, and we're trying to coordinate that and make sure that everyone who needs to be there is there. And then also just make sure everyone's where they need to be. Anything else, just as a general reminder that you can think of, Osha?
I think just in advance of the conference itself, making sure you have cell phone for everybody, and that, they have your cell phone so that you can kind of be a point of contact. I mean, staff can be available, obviously, to help deal with some of this stuff, but once we get mobilized, once staff is mobilized to be down there at the conference, then, they may not be able to check their email as much as they want and things like that. So as the moderator, being that point of contact, will problem solve for people, because the other thing that comes up is, somebody's kid gets sick or they can't make it, and all of a sudden, you've got to find somebody to stand in for a panelist, or so, you just want to make sure that you've made yourself available so people can get in touch with you if you have issues. And I would say if anyone does have any issues with getting a room at Tenaya, there are quite a few other places to stay. It's easiest to be there right at the lodge, but there's a lot of other good options, and there's more hotels in Oakhurst than we used to have. So, by no means should people feel like, oh, it just won't work if they don't have that room. And also, if you are on a wait list, those wait lists do tend to move. So definitely, if you would like to be for you or one of your speakers to be at the lodge, make sure you do work with Pam to get on the wait list, because chances are a lot of those people will end up getting rooms. And it will all work out, but it's just, we all got to kind of stay flexible and one way or the other, we'll make sure people have a place to stay.
All right, we've had someone who is participating in this call also remind us that if your panel has a moderator and a wrangler, then you can be splitting up a lot of these advanced work duties between the two of you, however it makes sense. I think I am the wrangler and the moderator, so I'm kind of speaking as if everyone has to do everything. But certainly, I mean, contacting the speakers, making sure they have what they need, reminding them of deadlines, getting the PowerPoint coordinated, all of that can be done by the moderator or the wrangler, or even the speakers can be assisting with some of this as well if they're a little techie. All right, so that leads us to any further questions that people may have, or if you would like us to address something that you think is important that we did not touch upon. Again, there will be some written guidelines given to everyone today. And if you have any other questions, we have Allison, who's one of our conference co-chairs this year. We have Pam, who unfortunately is coordinating the whole conference for this year. And we can also offer any comments now. Can we provide more detail about copyright requirements for slides, or mention where the detailed guidelines can be found? I'm just going to note that in presentations I've been part of, the photos tend to be the one thing I'm aware of. Sometimes people will include funny little graphics from a movie, or like I said, they've copied a picture from online, or it's a specific graph or table that someone else has created that they're including. I would just be very careful about that. And then also, I'm guessing that the State Bar MCLE written materials guidelines would also be expanding on that. OSHA, have you seen that as part of the annual meeting conference?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. For a bunch of lawyers, we always seem to have trouble with this one, so maybe it's embarrassing. But I mean, I think there's a lot of stuff that's out there in the general realm, which is under the rule of fair use, which can be used. And then, yeah, it's kind of with the photos that people get a little awry. I will note there are a lot of free sources of photos. I know, like Department of Water Resources, for instance, has a great photo bank of like almost anything you could think of. And I think in general, when you give credit, if you put a photo credit, then that often can take care of any some of these issues as well. So and I'd end up just drawing on photos I took with various things, too. I mean, so that's another way to go. You can obviously give permission to use your own stuff, or stuff that's kind of out there in the general public. So I wouldn't worry. I mean, I think if you can put the materials together, and then that's part of trying to meet that date on the 21st, is if there's problems with any of that, then that'll get identified and corrected. And if you have specific things you want to use, then we might be able to work with you to figure out alternatives that would be copywritten.
Also, Pam is reminding us that for a variety of reasons. I mean, I think both the State Bar rules for MCLE as well as copyright rules mean that you wouldn't just, for example, print out a case from Lexis or Westlaw and say, here's my written materials, because that is proprietary to them. At the same time, a copy of a case does not qualify as sufficient written material. There's no analysis going into it. There's no extra educational component. Pam also has noted that the written materials should be a minimum of 5 pages and preferably no more than 25 pages. So that's not that much that you have to be worried about in terms of making the education requirement. On a personal note, I have a subscription with iStock Photo just for my business's purposes. And usually the photos allow you to use them for educational purposes. It's a limited use license in that regard. So if you're looking for pictures that aren't simply open source, then that might be another way to get them too.
Yeah, and I mean, in thinking about the content of what you might be putting on a slide, like if you just take that same material and put it in an outline format, then that's a good way to just, again, it's only 5 pages of material. It's supposed to be, kind of original. But I mean, obviously super original, but like if rather than submit for your materials a whole pages and pages of PowerPoints, why not just take that and put it in more of a an outline format with the information. I think another thing that I have found useful is just lists. I mean, now it's so easy to get reference materials that it's more about like knowing what they are is a good resource. So I know often I've included as part of the written materials like a references list that is, a list of articles or cases or other regulatory materials, simply using sites. You could include a link because people will be getting their materials electronically. So links can also be helpful and help people get there quicker. And that, I mean, to me, that's like probably when it, that should be a page in the reference materials for most of these things. I think would be useful because if someone comes to your panel and they would like to know more and get back to it, having this references list would be a great way to, follow up on some of the things that they heard at the panel.
And then on the topic of coordinating, and especially for people who have, 4, I don't know if we have any panels with more than 4 people to try to coordinate. There has been a tip put where if you have a group call, making sure you set your next meeting, while you're still all there and you can pull out your calendars and you can all commit to that time rather than trying to send out, dozens of emails amongst people or use, a doodle poll or, the when to meet in order to try to get everyone to commit. I mean, because that in and of itself usually takes days just to set the date that you're going to actually meet next. So that is another tip that someone has shared with us. So we still have a little bit more time, or we can let people get on with their day. Allison or Pam, can you think of anything that you would like to make sure people are aware of and share?
I just want to emphasize one more time about the Q&A and that's a definitely an important part of the Wrangler's duty. And the moderator's duty is to make sure that Q&A is actually being monitored. So being brave and saying like, hey, your 1 minute or 2 minutes is up, or what is the question? I think once again, it's really important. And I know it can be an intimidating environment for moderators, but sometimes that's really important to help out the speakers and help out the entire conference. So other than that, you covered everything I expected and more. So thank you so much, both Jennifer and Osha. That was fantastic. And yeah, better than I ever hoped.
On the questions, one thing I've done as a moderator is write a list of questions that I hope the panel will answer throughout the course of the 90 minutes. And then I just print that out and bring it up there with me. And as the things get answered, I just kind of check them off. And then when we open it up for questions on the somewhat unlikely event that people don't pop up with a bunch of questions, or if there's a couple questions that I really think ought to be answered first, I might ask those questions across the panel before, assuming I can also provide the 10 or 15 minutes to ask a couple of those across the panel, maybe before we open it up to the rest of the room. So I think I like to think of it in terms of like, what information am I hoping that people take away from it, or what differences between the viewpoints or on this area of the law whatever the issue tends to be. So that's a great way to organize things and make sure that at the end of the session, you've kind of touched on everything. And also it can help if the audience is, say it's like late afternoon and well, we don't do them in the late afternoon, so it's not too big, maybe like right before lunch and everybody's hungry. Like just try to liven people up and get them involved. But I would say, like, having read a lot of the commentary in the evaluations, I think the number one thing people complain about is that if time wasn't provided for questions.
That is true.
So if you don't get a lot of questions as a moderator, you're super engaged. You could go back to your list of questions and get people going, no problem. But the audience they've sat there, they've been polite, they've given you their time. They want to feel like, they get their chance too, even if it's brief. And so I would say that's like one of the most common things.
And I also like to ask my speakers, like, what are some things that you've heard? Like, what is an area where you get some pushback? Or, what is it that you think is really interesting? It just doesn't necessarily fit within the scope of what you're presenting today. And that can be really great feedback as well, to make sure that if you end up with some downtime, you tee up a really interesting topic, or, like I said, do a little bit of devil's advocate. One other thing I'm going to note is we do try every year to make sure that people stay through the end of the conference. And historically, we lose a lot of attendees if you have that last panel of the day spot on Sunday, where people are, they're trying to make one more trip into Yosemite, or they're trying to hit the road to go home. We've tried to put some really interesting panels during that time to entice people to stay. But you might also think about ways to, keep the audience there and engaged. And, I almost included a picture of the panel from the State Water Resources Control Board's anniversary party, where Michael Lawfer, the chief counsel, bought a cake through the Tenaya and served everybody birthday cake. And we actually had people from other panels come in afterward to share in the birthday cake. So, whatever you can do, that raffle something off, we're trying to do our part to keep people there, but just be aware, that one might be, a little hard to keep people at.
I can add to that too. I was a wrangler for the panel in the very last session last year, Yosemite. And while we were very disappointed in that time slot, when we actually did it, it was well attended. We had the one on shelterless encampments and water quality. And we had a solid, probably 25, 30 people in the room, despite it being the last panel. So things like that do really help. And if you could talk up your section, make sure you talk to all your colleagues and friends, and during the session, actually, but days before, say, hey, I'm moderating this panel on Sunday. You should really attend. And I think that little bit of guilt and encouragement and excitement can really go a long way to making sure people stick around.
Right. And but also warn your panelists, right? I think that if people aren't familiar with the conference, they you certainly don't want them to feel like they're the issue, or that we could have done something differently, perhaps, to honor their spot and their time. We do everything we can. And we just cross our fingers and hope for the best. But I think, as Allison just noted, the people who stay are super committed. So, it'll be a strong panel. It just won't necessarily look as crowded.
One thing I would say we're doing with the annual meeting, and I think it should be done the same way here, is asking your panelists to put out on their LinkedIn about the panel that they're speaking on. And, not everybody who sees that's going to necessarily be at Yosemite. And Yosemite is the kind of conference where we actually can't fit everybody who wants to be there sometimes. But, having your speakers actually do some self-promotion around the topic and whatnot, and trying to get the interest level up, that's another way to keep a lively session. But that said, there's no shame in being put in the forest room and being one of the smaller rooms. I think those panels often are able to delve deeper into topics and get more audience feedback because it is a smaller group. So I guess that's the other thing, is if you end up in a topic, and we don't always know when we come up with these topics, like, is it going to be like the blockbuster topic that gets the big room, or is it going to be more like a side issue? But some of the very best panels I've seen, I've sometimes been in the smaller rooms. So I really don't think that's the measure of it. And we're recording a lot of them or all of them, Pam. I mean, so there's not all of them. So that's the other thing, is this content's going to be available to people into the future, so that people who aren't able to actually come in person can still learn from it and whatnot. So there's huge value in that as well.
And I would say, I mean, we try to pick really engaging topics every year. So, people do have to unfortunately decide. There are some panels I really wanted to go to that are actually competing against mine. So, I think the moral of the story is also remember, as OSHA said, that they're being recorded. And so that's all the more reason to kind of keep them moving along, keep them engaged, because it will hold an audience differently if they're watching it on playback later. And everybody will have access, I believe, to the full conference for a limited amount of time, if I remember correctly.
You mean at no cost? I'm not sure. I think it might have been during the
only during the
COVID
pandemic.
times. Yeah.
All right. Well, then never mind. I take that back. You can edit this out. But other people will have the chance to watch it later if they so desire. All right. Are there any other comments or questions? Everyone knows exactly what to do. They're all good to go. We're going to have no missed deadlines and no problems with the panels.
September 21st for the PowerPoints.
And actually, let me just, because I'm a lawyer, I can't help myself. I'm going to put in one other word. I also would encourage you to either talk to other folks who are moderating panels, or talk to your speakers and maybe forecast, any areas where you think like, well, this is going to get a little sensitive, or, this is one perspective of many, and try to think in advance how you all might handle that. Again, the role of the moderator is not just to let your speakers like do their thing and then facilitate the questions, but also to anticipate, how to engage your audience, and also, how to address the fact that hopefully we are doing a good job in presenting viewpoints that aren't always going to be agreed with by everyone, and what to expect and how to present that, and people's reactions. And the more we can anticipate, perhaps the more people will feel heard and respected as well.
No, I think these are all great points. And as the CLA staff, I'm here and happy to help answer any questions, or, if you do know you're struggling with that deadline, just keeping the open communication, right? Let us know what's going on so we can kind of be better prepared. As Jennifer said, it's not only going through things and making sure it meets the criteria it needs to meet. We upload it, we have them available electronically for folks. So there's a lot of stuff that goes onto the back end for it. So thank you, guys. I really do appreciate all of this information. It looks like we might have another question that came in. Oh, just a thank you from Shannon.
And thank you all for coming.
Thank you again, both Jennifer and OSHA. It was wonderful to have you.
We'll see you.
Thanks, everyone. See you in Yosemite.
Yeah, thank you.